Have you ever said, "Can I borrow $5?" Or, "That's a lot of dough"? This slang actually comes from a time when deerskins were used as a form of currency. Native Americans were intricately involved in global trade networks, so much so that their most abundant resource became synonymous with money itself. Today, we welcome Beau Robbins to discuss the North American fur trade and native economies. This is Too Complicated for History.
Welcome to Too Complicated for History. I am Isaac S. Loftus, and every other week, my co-host and I, Dr. Lynn Robbins, are joined by a guest to discuss the things that fell through the cracks in your history curriculum, the things that were too complicated to discuss in history class. Today, we are talking about the deerskin trade in 18th century America with a very special guest, who I'll let Lynn introduce.
Today's guest is Beau Robbins, a historian, a historical interpreter, and most importantly, my husband. Beau, I'm going to let you describe what you're going to talk about today because it's quite complicated. In fact, some might say too complicated for history.
Thanks, Lynn. Yeah, I got into living history because it was something that I found engaging when I was young folk. I think there's always something that we can latch onto as historians or people interested in history that really spurred that interest. And for me, it was other historical interpreters like me. I think it's one of the most engaging ways to reach out and educate people. So that's typically the most of what I do. And the neat thing about that is the material culture of the time that we're interpreting is vastly more important than it is to scholars and academics, because, you know, any Washington scholar like yourself worth their salt can tell you, oh, on this date, Washington had this dinner with this people, and this is the reason, and this is what came out of that. And I'm the guy that asks, cool, what did the table look like? What did the forks look like? What kind of plates were they eating off of? And now that, you know, we get into historical cinema and docuseries and things like that I've helped with you guys, it's important to know those details from history, to know what they looked like in order to help show the public.
So for our audience that doesn't know, Beau, could you just, like, in a couple sentences, explain what living history is? Because I'm sure that people have seen it, but they may not know the term.
So a lot of people refer to them as reenactors, which I consider something different. There's a lot of people that do a lot of different historical activities where they might play dress up and reenact a certain historical event. Usually it has something to do around a battle. Usually we think of them as Civil War reenactors or reenactors of American Revolution and other conflicts and so on and so forth. A living history person, interpreter, is really somebody who, like an actor, adopts the persona of a historical person or figure, whether it's actual or somewhat amalgamated, fictitious, if you will, and then they interpret the history through that activity of acting like that person. So they're in the first person interpreting the history for the consuming public. They go to historical events, classrooms, and things of that nature. You know, growing up in Central Florida, it became really evident to me that nobody really understood the context, the historical context of Florida and what that was like. And so I grew up in Central Florida, but I also lived out in the Rocky Mountains for almost 20 years as well. And one thing I noticed out there when it comes to living history, there's just not a lot of Florida. When I grew up in history in the public school system, it was taught to me that, Florida was discovered by this explorer, Ponce de Leon, in the 16th century. And then nothing happened until this other explorer came around, and by the name of Walt Disney, who built a mouse-infested castle. And the rest is history. There's also some stories about, like, this Johnny Appleseed character, but it is orange seeds instead. And that's all that's ever happened in Florida, period. And then, of course, as an adult, as a burgeoning historian, I discovered that's really not the case. In fact, the history of where I grew up is some of the most history rich in stories and sites and areas. Because, for instance, St. Augustine, Florida, the old capital, was 50 years old. It was a thriving little metropolis by the time Jamestown was settled.
And that's not what we hear about in Virginia.
Exactly. So, yeah, first Thanksgiving, Florida. First colony, Florida. 500 years of history, just about. So it's a really neat place. And yes, things happened. The stories are outstanding. They're crazy. They're complicated. They're dramatic. And, I wanted to help other people like me understand those stories. So I did a lot with the Southeastern culture where I grew up. I summered in the Carolinas and the Appalachians, Western Carolina. But then I also spent 20 years out in Wyoming where, if you want to go to an event out there, it's probably going to be a mountain man rendezvous, and which is really interesting. And that has to do with the fur hide trade, the fashion phenomenon of the top hat, which was relying on the beaver furs that were trapped out west. The interesting thing is, to me, in my mind, this spurred this whole romantic idea of westward expansionism, of explorers. You've got tons of movies from Charlton Heston's Mountain Man to Robert Redford's was it Jeremiah Johnson to the most recent one with Leonardo DiCaprio, The Revenant. You can go to a mountain man rendezvous in Florida, even though the history didn't happen there. You can go to them all over the West. You can go to a mountain man rendezvous in Maine and even Hawaii. But you can also go to them in Europe. So I find it odd that this little 20-year footnote in American history, it had a lot to do with our expansion as a country. But I think this romanticized idea of moving west has, is largely blown out of proportion in contrast to this other hide trade that is almost never talked about and didn't last for 20 years. It lasted for over 200 years. And that's the deer hide trade in the Southeast North America. And the trade in deer hides is what cemented the relationship between the European colonizers. You're talking about France, Spain, and England. But that's what cemented their relations to Native America. Was this deer hide trade that lasted for 2 centuries. And that's something I really, really enjoy talking about and interpreting.
Yeah, I think we're going to get into it, but just to prep our listeners for this is the complexity of this trade network and the sophistication of it blew my mind the first time I heard about it. Because there is we talk about sort of like the fantasy in the popular imagination of what that time was like. I guess the reductive version of the way we picture those times is very much like a barter and trade system. Where like, hey, I have 3 chickens and you have 2 pigs. Can I give you, 2 chickens for half a pig, whatever, like that kind of, that's as sophisticated as the economy got, but that's not the case at all.
That I think that we're taught in elementary school when we're taught that, like around maybe Thanksgiving time or whenever, public schools got into any kind of Native American topics. It's the way I like to analogize it is like, I think at least those of us at our age, I know they still exist, like at Dave and Buster's, but maybe it was Chuck E. Cheese's. To me, we had this putt-putt place that had all these video games, and you go in and you play whack-a-mole, and you win the tickets, and then you go into their little, gift shop or whatever, and you cash them in for whatever kind of knickknacks,
probably a plastic cone.
Yeah, something made in China, and you get plastic cone, whatever. You save up your little tickets, and then you cash them in for whatever you can afford out of that little shop. And that's exactly how the deer hide trade. But instead of playing whack-a-mole, they were playing whack-a-deer.
Something else that's important that I think really shocked me is that we hear in history, sort of in the age of industrialization and moving, forward there, this idea of globalization. You never think of that term as relating to Indigenous Americans.
Absolutely. Right. And so what I'm getting to is the reality of the 18th century British Native American relation was that, instead of cashing your tickets in for all these little foreign manufactured trinkets, they're actually going into the shop, taking whatever they needed or wanted, and then the following year saying, okay, well, now I'm going to have to bring you back X amount of tickets of value. And so everything flowed on a system of credit. And this is what, the globalization does, because when you're moving massive amounts of manufactured goods from Europe to North America and massive amounts of deer skins and other commodities back to Europe, and it's not just England, it's a global export economy, it all has to move on credit. And so the reality was these indigenous people down in the Southeast They are essentially getting goods from the traders on a system of credit at the beginning of the year, and then at the end of hunting season, they're due however many bucks or buckskins that they owe. And this was all very heavily regulated at times, some more than others. But it does a number of things for the British in particular. Now, the France and Spain, they're doing this too, right? So to paint this picture of what North America looks like at the beginning of the 18th century, you have, we'll start in the West. You have the French corridor, which is the Mississippi corridor. They've got a chain of forts all the way up and down the Mississippi, from Canada all the way down to New Orleans. And then on the east side, you've got the British, the 13 colonies on the Atlantic coast. But then you also have Spain. They have Florida and some of the East Indies, West Indies, Mexico, and so forth. Now in the middle, sandwiched in the middle of that Appalachian corridor between France and British holdings, are also three competing superpowers. And in the north, you've got the Haudenosaunee, the Iroquois Confederacy, who are up in the northern Appalachia, Adirondacks, Great Lakes area, what's today New York. And then on the southern end, below the Appalachian corridor, Alabama, Georgia, into Tennessee, you've got the Creek Confederacy. And then sandwiched in the middle of them, in the Appalachian corridor, you've got the Cherokee. And there's other tribes, the Westos, the Shawnee, the Oconee, Catawbas. There's just tons of them, but they're not quite the superpowers, and they don't have the confederacies that the Creeks do in the south, or the Cherokee and the Iroquois do up north. And so you've got three major European superpowers vying for dominance here, this North American continent, before the 7 Years' War. And they're using these other three superpowers to help cement their foothold in North America. So what this trade does is basically six things. It creates these politically essential alliances, because if you're not actively trading with your neighbor, you're at war with them. And so you want to be on their good side, and you get on their good side through trade. And so through these alliances, number two, you're creating your auxiliary martial forces. So you've got military forces in the form of these native gunmen who can fight on your behalf. And they can fight either your enemies. If you're British, it might be the French, and the French allied other natives. And that's a really good thing as a protection force, or a buffer zone between these competing colonies. But it also creates a market for European manufactured goods. And at the time, in the 18th century, we're going through an industrial revolution, and manufacturing processes are getting very refined, very good at producing quality goods cheaply in mass quantities. And so now, Europe's looking at these indigenous populations going, wow, there's a whole new consumer base for these goods. But they're not getting them for free. They're generating raw materials. So number four, you've got the generation of raw materials for this emerging European manufacturing core in the form of leather, deerskins. And that's because there was a blight going on in the early 18th century. It comes about again in the 1750s on cattle, and believed to be originated in France. So the British embargoed all French imports of bovines from France. Byproduct of which is leather. Many things were used from leather, used for leather, like bookbinding, upholstery, industrial belting materials, garments, whatever. So leather was in short supply, and it was a hot commodity. There's also another fashion trend booming in the 18th century, just like the beaver fur top hat. Now, the beaver top hats did exist prior to that, and that was a part of what led on the fur trade in the late 17th century. But then that fades. People began making these hats out of buckskin, but more predominantly, it was buckskin breeches. I mean, Washington even wore a pair. It was like your blue jeans of the 18th century. And there was a dire need for really soft, supple garment weight leather. And this eventually, number five, draws natives out of a subsistence economy into a global export economy. They were hunter-gatherer and agrarian people all the way up and down the Appalachian corridor. until they get, like, as Lynn pointed out, they get drug into this global export economy because the goods that they're receiving and producing are going into a global market. So when we think of an 18th century, Creek Indian, for example, what did they look like? In school, we're probably taught that they're dressed in furs and hides and buckskins and things like this. And before contact, yeah, that's absolutely the case. But within just a few generations of being engaged in this trade, they're absolutely dressed in almost virtually completely by foreign manufactured goods. So their leggings, their breechcloths are made out of British wool, Irish linens for the shirts. They're wearing beads that were probably made in either Murano or Amsterdam. A lot of them wore fancy feathers in their hair, the same that were favored by ladies and ladies' hats and officers' hats. These are ostrich plumes. Where do they come from? Well, they're from Africa. They're painting themselves with vermilion that was mined in India as in the form of cinnabar. Highly toxic, but a very vibrant red color. So they're
it equals out.
Yeah. So in reality, the only thing they're wearing that's of indigenous manufacturers are moccasins. They predominantly stay, made out of buckskin into the 19th century, and but otherwise they're just completely adorned and engrossed in consumer foreign manufactured goods.
So sorry for the interruption, but we're going to take a brief break now for a word from our sponsors.
There's a lot to get into, I think, for all of those, and it's super important. But just to make sure that our listeners understand exactly the function of this, let's get really micro. So say I'm a member of the Cherokee Nation, and I'm a young man, and I'm looking to, I could either be hunting right now, or there's a trading post out here that's been established that I might be able to trade some buckskins for. So how would someone like that become involved in this? On a micro level.
So on a micro level, it depends on the age. We think of natives as using the bow and arrow, but by the beginning of the 18th century, most of them had guns. Now, you're obviously not handing your 10-year-old a gun, but kids would start out using bow and arrows or the older technology. Blowguns would be a good one in the Southeast where the river cane grows. They would hunt with blowguns, probably to protect their mother's garden and things like that nature. It teaches them patience, gives them something to do. It's kind of fun. It builds their hunter instincts until their uncle or somebody would make them their first bow and arrow, which they could use to hunt deer. And at that time, let's say in 1767, and the prices stay pretty static throughout the 18th century, but you're looking at about 16 pounds of buckskins for a gun. And so once you save up $16, then you can move on from the bow and arrow to the gun and start becoming a very, very proficient hunter. In order to engage in the trade, you have to be able to procure what the trader wants, which is buckskins. And so you walk into the trading post in the beginning of the year, probably prior to hunting season. You get yourself what you need. You're going to need powder. You're going to be ammunition, maybe some gun tools. Maybe you need some clothing, and so forth. So you're going to acquire these things on credit. And then at the end of the year, hopefully you've acquired enough buckskins to pay off that debt, which was usually capped off at about $30. At that time, you've proven yourself as a provider, and you can go ahead and start looking at, getting a wife or two.
Sure. So all that stuff is, so the things that you are necessary to acquire the buckskins at the volume that the trader, to engage. Basically, I need a gun and I need the powder and all that stuff like that. All that is foreign manufactured. I'm not able to so the money that I'm bringing in is really leaving to go get the gear necessary to do that again the next season.
Yes, everything that they were consuming is basically it's a wear part. It's expendable. It's not going to be something that lasts. They used these guns and cannibalize them until there nearly aren't any left. There might be one or two floating around out there in a museum somewhere, as far as a good 18th century trade gun. That's how. There were so many of them coming in. They were used so much that there's actually none of them left, if that makes any sense. They also have a custom, especially with the Creek people, in their busk, which is their kind of like the New Year. Think of it as a green corn ceremony, and the height of August, the heat of the summer, once the corn crop is established but not yet ripe, so to speak, they would have a 4-day ceremony. And traditionally, all their old food stores, a lot of their pots, a lot of their own indigenously manufactured goods was destroyed and then made anew. All the fires were relit, and it's kind of this renewal ceremony. The traders loved that because, here they were once a year, placing their order saying, oh, they're going to go through their busk ceremony. We better load up the storehouse because they're all going to need new stuff right after green corn.
Gotcha.
So, yeah. And then that leads right into hunting season in the fall. So, yeah.
So talking about the economy and sort of the change in the culture, I think it would help if you could give us an idea of how families worked before. So what was the man's job? What was the woman's job when they were subsistence economy? And then how that changed when they became this global culture, essentially, with the new economy.
Well, yeah, that's a real great question. That leads us to the one of the biggest unintended consequences of what the trade did was it led to societal change. Obviously, we touched on that. And, you had foreign manufactured when before contact, they're making all their tools out of stone, bone, shell, things of that nature. They're making them themselves. And then within just a few generations, that's oblivious. It's gone. It's just they lose all their indigenous manufacturing processes. Or become completely reliant on the foreign manufactured goods. So that's one way in which their society changed. But as far as like the structure of the family, they were heavily bifurcated with gendered tasks, primarily in the Creeks, where there's man things and there's woman things, and they don't cross. And what happens is women obviously are the producers of the progeny because women give birth to the children. So children was primary responsibility of the women. The children actually belong to the women and their tribe or their family, their clan. And the clans all follow a matrilineal descendancy. So instead of like today where we'd go on Jerry Springer to find out who the father is, they really don't care because your mother is still your mother.
Gotcha. Oh, that's interesting.
That's completely ignored. Fathers have very little responsibility. The men in the family who are responsible for the upbringing of other young boys would be the matrilineal uncles. So, your mother's brothers would be responsible for showing you the ropes of manhood and becoming a warrior. And then women taught the girls.
Not to go off on a tangent here, but that actually really explains how you get these men who are the sons of the colonials.
Yes.
Right. And especially if they're rich colonials or wealthy colonials and have like a native mother, how they were getting the best of both worlds. Right. They're like,
really
hey, if I have a good lineage on my native side, on my mother's side, then I am of good status here. And then on my father's side, I've I'm inheriting all of his stuff or his wealth or whatever it is. That's an interesting. Yeah. So that's an interesting dynamic because there are a ton of men who are, had colonial or, Scottish, European fathers. That made names for themselves and were very important people, but that helps explain why, they ended up being important in both societies.
But to better answer Lynn's question,
sorry, that was
this sexual bifurcation of tasks starts to erode. The men are responsible for the life taking because women bring life into the world, men take it away. Men are the hunters and the warriors. So they're good at killing things and breaking stuff. The women are the exact opposite. We bring life into the world, our children, we take care of the children, but also farming was the responsibility of the women because it's growing things, it's creating life. And that starts to erode once the populations of the deer either decline or the demand for the deer skins goes up. Men are spending more and more time of the year devoted to hunting. And they're hunting so many deer that they can't afford to process these hides as quickly. So now they're bringing women onto the hunting trail, into the hunting camps to process these hides. Men are going out and dragging deer into the camp just as fast as they can. And women are spending more and more of their time away from their fields in the men's hunting camps in order to process the hides, that once they get back to town in the off season, the men are having to make that up by helping the women in the fields.
And this became necessary in part because, like, hey, we don't have the domestic manufacturing, because I need to have the new stuff, and I can only buy that from the trading posts or via imports with processed deer hides.
Right. So similar that's analogy to today would be how most two-parent households, both parents work, because a woman almost has to work nowadays just to pay the man's income taxes, right?
Right.
So
yeah, I mean, we went through this actually discussion with my just for the listeners who don't know, I have a 9-month-old son, and we actually had to go through and do the math and budget out whether it was even worth it for my wife to go back to work at any point, because 100% of her income would be going to childcare. So
Absolutely.
It's like at a certain level, like what do we, what value are we doing here? Like, are we adding anything by doing that, or are we just contracting out the work of raising our son?
Right.
But that's an interesting dynamic that debt focused economies suffer from. That's like, where you're reliant on on purchasing stuff from outside of the home or imports or whatever. It's interesting.
And I imagine things like art and skills that maybe are less necessity, but more about making beautiful things.
Leisure activities.
Those are going to fall off. A lot of skills are not going to be passed on to children because there's just no time. So you're losing a lot of that as well.
Absolutely.
This is a really unique and enlightening example of how, trade and regulations and rules and how things happen have unintended consequences and societal change. It's not necessarily the other way around, because you could explain this, like an economist could explain this, like the pots were better.
They really
Therefore,
were.
that's the ones that they wanted, right? And that's why they stopped doing all of the things that they wanted. It's like, no, that's not necessarily true. They are better, yes, that's absolutely, but they didn't choose to stop pursuing their lifestyle because they wanted to do this. It was out of necessity because of all these other mitigating factors. That's an interesting complication to that.
Because they weren't making guns, they weren't making these things that they absolutely needed.
Right.
So you're constantly, it's like working, you're constantly in debt. It's like your credit card. You're constantly trying to pay it back.
And you said a lot of deerskin. Like how many deerskin are we talking about? Like how many left American shores in a given whatever? Like is there a good metric?
So in the early days of the trade, let's say 1698 through 1715, just prior to the Yamasee War, you're looking at about 53,000 deer hides per annum. Now that drastically drops the following year because of something called the Yamasee War, and one of the reasons why the trade was heavily regulated was in those early days, one of the biggest commodities wasn't necessarily just deerskins or hides or clay or naval stores, but it was actually people. And so natives were actually going out and capturing slaves from other enemies and things like that, bringing them back to the British and selling them off as slaves. And they'd go down to the West Indies, probably get them off of the continent so they couldn't run off. They were ended up growing things like sugar. Well,
if they ended up in the West Indies, it explains why there's not a lot of communities left, because they worked them in the West the West Indies. They worked them to death. Yeah.
Absolutely.
And in Florida, this was one of the more extreme examples. A lot of there just really aren't any first Floridians left. Some genetics might still exist down in Cuba. They might have gotten mixed in with the Spanish, and when the Spanish left after the American Revolution, they might have ended up there. So a few might have assimilated in with the Seminole. We're not really sure, but most died either through the ravages of slave raids or disease, and aren't known to survive to this day. But anyway, it jumps. So those numbers drop during the Yamasee War, which was the pretty much a lot of the people in the Southeast, primarily the Yamasee, some of the Creeks, they decided they were being taken advantage of by the traders, and they were tired of all this conflict being inherently thrust upon them. So the rumors would spread like, oh, these people are going to attack you, or, these people are fixing to attack you. And so that would be a boon for the traders who could sell a lot of ammunition by keeping them in conflict with each other. But they got tired of enslaving each other. And so they went to war with the Carolinians in 1715 with the help of some of the Creeks. That lasted about a year. It was very devastating on the southeastern colonies. So only 4,702 hides were shipped that year. Whoa. But the numbers go back up. By 1721, we're up to 60,000. And the numbers only climb. 1741, just out of Augusta alone, 100,000 pounds of deer hides were exported.
That's just out of Augusta.
Augusta.
Do we have like a peak? Is there like hey, this was the top of at any given year?
John Stewart, who was the second superintendent of British Indian Affairs down in the Carolinas, in 1764, he claims that 800,000 pounds of deer skins were exported.
So sorry for the interruption, but we're going to take a brief break now for a word from our sponsors.
Okay, I don't mean to sound stupid, but how did we not run out of deer? I mean,
we did.
It just sounds ridiculous.
So we did. Their populations declined, and by the 19th century, the white-tailed deer in North America was darn near extinct.
That does not surprise me.
And this
they recovered really well.
Not only did it recover very well, it did. There's probably more whitetail here now than there ever were.
Yeah, so there's a lot of deer.
Stories.
Yeah, we see them everywhere.
Just one thing with the Yamasee War that's actually, I think, is interesting for context going forward is that conflict was you said it was devastating for the southeastern colonies. Mm-hmm. It was so bloody that they never really felt the same way towards Native people again.
Absolutely not.
It colored the way that those colonies and then later states approached their interactions with Native nations forever. Right. There's a reason why. There's a reason why those folks are like the first ones to push west, like the first areas for removal, like all of those things after America is founded. It's partly because, like, hey, we've had a lot of really, really intense conflict with these folks. We don't see there's animosity that lingered for a long time. And most
of the regulation of the trade is saw right thereafter. Like that's really where the regulation comes in. So all the traders were licensed before the Yamasee War, and we see this again in the 1790s with the American. We touch on that in the docuseries and things like that. But every colony was kind of going all sua sponte, dealing with these folks on their own, and that doesn't work because, for instance, the Cherokee. They're dealing with the Carolinas. They're dealing with Georgia. They're also dealing as far as north as Williamsburg and Virginia. And so there's a lot of overlap. And what one colony does affects all the others. Mm-hmm. And we see that in the Cherokee War in 1760. But, some of these things are unavoidable. But in reality, the royal authorities understood that they needed to take over the assumption of control and licensure so that what one colony did wasn't affecting another. And so
that's an interesting thing.
They formed the British Department of Indian Affairs, basically. It was a British Indian Department. It was broken down into two hemispheres. You had Sir William Johnson up in the north dealing with the Iroquois mostly. He was up in Albany, and he's dealing with the northern sector and in charge of that. But then in the southern sector, so from Virginia on south, you had another superintendent in the southern department. Edmund Atkins was the first, followed by John Stewart, and then William Burnfoot Brown. And they did a lot to help ensure the alliances, secure trading partners, license the traders. So they were traveling quite a bit, going from town to town, trying to put out fires, kissing hands, shaking babies, that kind of thing.
Sure. How in the world out of curiosity, did folks keep track of like this credit? Because I assume the trading post, right? So like I have all this ammunition, right? They don't have the skins to pay for that. Like they must have been operating on some level of speculation and credit, or some level of credit or liquidity on their own too. I assume that they're not buying their ammunition with liquid capital, mostly because there was not a lot of money in like just actual physical. They call it the term is species. There's not a lot of actual money available in North America at the time at all.
There wasn't.
So I assume that they're getting creditors that are using their money. Like, I imagine like paper ledgers, like tracing all the way back to like the Netherlands, all the way down to like here. It must have been super complex. Like that system is insane, but it was all on paper. Yeah, like
there was about 5 levels of speculation. You have the exporters of these goods, so they're buying up goods from the manufacturers in England. Most of these guys are out of London or Bristol. A lot of the stuff's coming out of either Birmingham, London, Bristol, Gloucester, and being exported from there. Now, those folks are sending the goods here to North America on a system of credit to the importers of the goods. So you had merchants, big ones like Henry Lawrence and some of these others in South Carolina who are just importing massive amounts of goods, and then they are moving it to these actual businesses, these corporations. A lot of them dealt specifically with the trade. There was at one time what was called the Augusta Company. And a lot of people don't know, for the listeners, Augusta, Georgia was almost specifically formed to be an Indian trade hub. And for all these goods to move, there was a road north to the Cherokee. There was a road out west to the Upper Creeks, a road to the southwest to the Lower Creeks. There was another road that went to the Choctaws and the Chickasaws, who lived right down the road near Silver Bluff. So most of these big players, as far as the trading partners, lived and operated out of Augusta for the longest time. Those goods would move through places like Charleston and Augusta, and then they would get on pack horses. These pack horses were going to the Indian towns, to the individual trade houses, wherever they might be. And they were usually somewhere in the neighborhood of like 250 mules thick. You would have about one pack horseman responsible for 5 horses or mules. They're just loaded to the gilt with everything from beads to guns and steel, knives, tools, hoes, gardening implements, cooking implements, and then textiles, because this deer hide trade could be considered a textile trade if you look at the other direction. Other than guns, the largest desirable commodity was textiles, English wools, linens, things like that to clothe people. But you also have silver ribbons and other decorative embellishments that aren't necessities, but don't women like them? And, beads and silver. And then, of course, rum, which was extremely regulated because it had disastrous effects at times when plied illegally by unlicensed traders. But anyway, you got to imagine 200 pack horses just loaded to the hilt with British consumables heading west to these towns. And when they get there, they unload it. The trader, who's the third or fourth in line, he puts all his stuff in the warehouse, and he's the one doling it out. He's the operator of the convenience store, so to speak.
The point of contact for all of this stuff.
He's the point of contact. He's the one that has the reputation. He lives in the town. Because of that, they were almost always married to one of the native women of that town or nearby towns. And that was to establish his clan status, because men usually you have to marry someone of a different clan. Obviously, these Europeans didn't belong to any, so they were good to go. But you basically, once you marry, you belong to the clan of your wife. Sort of. You're allied with that until the marriage is dissolved for whatever reason. But that makes sure that at least he has some kind of familial context within the society, because then it's her cousins and brothers that are going to be protecting your storehouse, making sure that everybody just doesn't go in there and take things willy-nilly.
Sure.
And usually they were, someone of prominent stature. These women married to these traders, who was something that helped cement the relationship between the British and the trading partners to that indigenous society. It was something that helped give them a little bit more credence in town. Plus, that storehouse was like the place to be. That was the hangout. That was where all the news came from. So having a lady aligned with that more closely gives her a lot of clout. So anyway, all those goods are flowing there, and from there, the pack horses are loading up with the deer skins that are being supplied, and it's not like going to the counter at Dave and Buster's with your handful of tickets. It's all these deer that are saved up throughout the season. So we're talking hundreds of pounds of hides loading onto hundreds of pack horses, and now they're making the long trek back to Augusta and then to Charleston. And so just like in Virginia, where the form of species was mostly in the form of tobacco, bales of pounds of tobacco, even had tobacco notes. The same thing's happening, but that form of species in bales of deer hides. So
is that where the word buck comes from? Like why that's referred to
really
as
does.
dollars?
There's some speculation as to it, but my fervent belief is that yes, absolutely, we see it references to it in the 18th century. If your listeners have ever heard the term, it takes a lot of dough to make a buck. It's not DOUGH, it's DOE, because doe skins were worth relatively half that of buck skins based on their thickness and size disparity. So that's why they started going to, instead of one buck skin, it was pounds of skins, because then you could have some dough thrown in there.
Sure.
And then you have to go by weight. So, relatively speaking, a doe was worth a Spanish dollar, or a shilling, $1. So that's really where the term starts to originate, and we still use that term today.
And then let's track those deer skin back the other direction, because we talked a little bit about it, but specifically, so those deer skins are leaving Charleston, getting on a boat, going back to England.
Yeah, just like tobacco, they go back to England to be processed. If they're not already tanned, they would be commercially tanned in an industrial setting, and then they would be exported by leather merchants to go wherever. Whoever needed the leather would buy from them. And
back to the colony.
A lot of these speculators don't even realize that they're engaged in this huge system of Indian trade. To them, it's just, this is where we don't know where it comes from. It's just stuff we need, and it comes from.
I've got a leather guy, and he delivers me leather, and then I should or skins, and I turn into leather, and then I send to France, and then I get turned into top hats or whatever, or breeches, or whatever, or pants.
So, a lot of these speculators aren't even sure that they're involved in this. It's just, a part of their economy.
Thinking about a global economy, then I think it's incredible. It was enlightening to me, just as far as like context of the complexity of the world, like just what you described, in the level of credit and the tracking of credit over seasons, over years. For some reason, it feels impossible. But it happened.
Impossible.
It feels impossible to have done, because I guess I'm just so I take for granted the fact that it's like a credit card and it goes on a machine, like it's a computer that does all of this stuff for us these days. Right? But it feels impossible. But
I guess it just took a lot longer.
It was, leading up to the Yamasee War, the Cherokee as a whole were something like 10,000 hides in debt to British merchants. And that was, and if you consider that the average production of them, we'll say it was probably about 4,000 to 5,000 hides. So how are they ever going to pay off that debt when they're constantly chasing that debt, when they're constantly adding to it?
So
right?
Big old British visas there.
I know
to charge
they
up
can't call and threaten from like a debt collector.
Now, was that debt actually? Did it have interest, or was it on, or is that at like zero interest debt? Like
I'm not sure. I want to think maybe both. I think in some cases they understood that, but in others, because everything moves so slowly. Like now, like you said, it's all computer. All my credit card info is instantaneous. Back then, you're talking about a boat. I think that had to be factored in. Like let's give him a little credit here, so to speak, and make it zero interest, because we understand that things are going to have to take time. But there was an assumption of debt that was unbelievably large, right?
Yeah.
And so the Yamasee War was an easy way of canceling that debt. right? It's like you got two things: you either pay it off, default, or you go to war with your creditor.
You hear that, millennials with college loans? You hear that? Those are the three ways. Yes, if you try two.
So what happens if you default?
Well, we got to have a come to Jesus talk, and that seems to happen throughout
Like
the
the
18th century about every, because you don't want to go to war. They tried that, and that was horrible. And it does happen again, throughout the French and Indian War, the American Revolution, and the Cherokee War, and even into the Seminole Wars. And you go out west, you're talking about Red Cloud's War into the 1870s. We knew what that was like, and everyone knew that they didn't want that because that, number one, that disrupts the trade. But it's also, intertribal warfare, interestingly enough, was definitely good for traders because they're, like the military industrial complex, they're, selling all kinds of guns and ammunition. They're booming when that happens, but that can also disrupt the trade as well. So what happens is, they come to treaty, usually in Augusta. I know 1762, 1767. We come to Augusta, and the number one commodity that they always did have that would pay off their debts was land. And so
interesting.
Instead of the idea that the colonizers come in and just take the land, really what it is, it's a settling of the debt. Now you can argue whether or not that debt was illicitly gained. In many cases, it absolutely was. It was absolutely ill-gotten through the pliance of rum and other illicit, unlicensed behaviors. But in most cases, it was all very well regulated. And most of the biggest traders in the game were very honest individuals.
So that brings up a question, I think. So just for context, there's some variance to like the details of this, but like for the most part in Native nations, like land wasn't individually held, generally speaking. So this is an interesting dynamic where like an individual debt or a small group debt is then being used to take control of something that wasn't necessarily being held by. So who was doing that? Did that lead to any conflict? Like, hey, these people are settling their debt, but like, the town that is actually sort of like the community that was then using that land as hunting ground or whatever wasn't involved in that transaction at all.
Huge amounts of conflict. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Because yes, you're absolutely right. As far as like Creek society down in the Southeast, there was no, all the land was communally owned. There was no private real property, but they did obviously have the sense of private property. But mostly it was like your personal possessions. Real property could be allotted to families, and families might have rights to it. But then again, it's still communal in a sense. And so, as far as the lands that the colonists wanted or the Americans wanted later on, you're looking at the expansion of the colonies. They're expanding into native hunting grounds. This is all communally owned. And what they're doing is basically negotiating parcels of it away in the cancellation of debt. So the royal authority comes in and says, look, we got to figure this out. The traders are owed a ton of bucks. We all realize you're never going to be able to pay this off. So we'll cancel this debt. So the royal authority would settle the debt. In response, they would create a treaty that would feature a land cession, so to speak. And then, it's like, well, we can settle now to this river. And then 10, 20 years later, all right, well, now we can settle to this river. And they're moving west and west and west. And that continues. I can see
how that's slightly more organized than like an individual person or a group of people settling with like an individual trader, right? Like trying to settle, like how they're, that there could be some level of organization to it. And
the interesting thing is, as far as land ownership is concerned, there's nothing communally owned, but part of the reason to make that more complicated is that there's no real central authority with whom to negotiate, because each town, whether it was Creek or Cherokee or whatever, these were autonomous little towns. There was no central convening authority like a tribe that we think of today, or tribal commission or tribal government that we have established today. That wasn't a thing. You had a town, people that lived in the town. They lived in that town. Each one has individual debt. And so to make things simpler, it's the British coming in and saying, look, we got to simplify this. So we're going to take all of you, paint you with a broad brush, put you into a nice tiny box because we want to deal with you all at once rather than dealing with 100 different little towns, each with a different headman who has no real authority. Now, that's not to say they don't get together. Yeah, obviously the towns get together. They have their own delegates and they come up with central ideas and beliefs that they execute. But the reality was there was no real actual authority. Like even the headman of a town, he would come up with make decisions and issue those through his deputy. And, if I live in that town, I could still say like, yeah, cool story, bro. We'll put that right here on the fridge. And I'm going to go back about my business because, his authority was based on his abilities as a leader. And that was a very neat thing about it was that it was a true meritocracy in a lot of sense. A lot of it was based on familial clanship and things like that. But, if they weren't a good leader, they just didn't get listened to and they got replaced. But, the British can't deal with that. They got to put everybody in a tight little box and deal with a nation. So they're nation building. And it's the same sort of thing we saw in like Afghanistan, when we walked into the, near Stone Age and dealt with a bunch of little towns and a bunch of little villages there in the Hindu Kush. And these people didn't, they didn't even think of themselves as what we did. We tried to put them into a box and say nation build. And they're like, yeah, pound sand.
That's actually an interesting comparison on a number of levels. Like,
it's the same thing.
Plugging in is actually really prescient given how weak the state that the United States tried to build in Afghanistan was, given the events of 2022, and how quickly it fell. Like it had really no foundational structure behind it.
Yeah, they just completely failed to learn these lessons of history. Like you have to look no further than the British apply for dominance in the 18th century North America. Like we could have handled that way better. Now the British had many successes in doing this. And so they would take individual debt and say, look, all you guys in this town, you owe this much. Let's just consolidate that. And then let's just put that in the same box with all the other creek towns. And let's just say, you guys all share the hunting rights to this land over here. We'd like to have that. So that's usually how these land cessions are coming about, by the consolidation of this debt.
And don't tell me the British authority turned around and then sold the rights to that land to someone else. They're like,
well, they'd make land grants,
they sold the land grants to other, companies or speculators or whatever.
Absolutely.
That's a great money making.
Well, it was. Some of these traders, for example, a lot of the Augusta traders, Lachlan MacGillivray, the first comes to mind. He started out in 1735, immigrates from northern Scotland, ends up in South Carolina as a pack horseman. And within 10 to 15 years, he's got his own trade house in central Alabama in the heart of Creek country, just a couple miles from the French fort of Toulouse. And he marries into the tribe. She was Wynn clan. He has progeny with her. The eldest son, Alexander MacGillivray, he has educated in Charleston. He gained some business experience in Charleston and Savannah. And then by the time the American Revolution comes about, he's in a really good position, that boy, to go back to his Creek home country and assume some authority within his people. And he's completely, by this time he probably speaks Latin and Greek better than his original Muskogee language. So he was a great one to step into the role, that dual role of a liaison, and he did. He had during the American Revolution, he had a commission as a captain, serving as what would you call him, a deputy superintendent of the British Southern Indian Department. He served in a few raids, and then once the British are kicked out after the American Revolution, he writes a letter of introduction to the Spanish authorities, who are now in control of Florida again, and says, hey, this is who I am, this is what I do, and you're going to give me that same job with a promotion, or else I've got 5,000 warriors that are just going to make your life hell. And so they agreed to his position. So he served as a Indian commissary to the Spanish for the Creeks, received a commission as a colonel through the Spanish, and was collecting a stipend. He also had 3 plantations, a couple, 3 wives, and about 65 slaves. So
he was a guy who was able to take advantage of and prosper in that system of the
because
global
his dad
economy
had, and so
understanding.
by the time his dad is done being a trade house, operating a trade house as a trader within Creek country, but prior to the revolution, he's already got a couple places of his. He's got a townhouse in Augusta. He's got another trade house just north of Augusta. He's got a huge plantation just outside of Savannah, right on the edge of Savannah. He's raising racehorses and rice and exporting rice. And then he has another plantation in Jamaica that he puts one of his cousins on to manage, as well as kind of he still has his hands in the trading empire, but he's rising through those levels of speculation that we talked about, getting higher and higher and higher to where he's, super wealthy aristocrat. The problem is he was a staunch loyalist. And so when the American Revolution come around, about the time his son Alex goes back to Creek country, he's a loyalist, and a lot of his property was basically confiscated by the Whig, the more Whiggish authorities there in Georgia. So it didn't work out. He did all right. He goes back to Scotland. We don't know that he ever has anything to do with his Creek progeny, his children and grandchildren that he had. But
so speaking of the McGillivray, the Alexander McGillivray, can you tell us a little bit, because I know we're kind of moving toward the end of the episode, and I really want to touch on the Treaty of New York in 1790, because it's the first treaty. It's the first treaty with a foreign nation that our nation, the United States, and the
post-constitutional treaty with Native Americans.
Yes. And he considered that a foreign treaty because they had their own nation.
Yeah, just like the British had to figure out that we can't let the individual colonies deal on their own all willy-nilly. We did the same thing as Americans, and that was the first test case of our federal government having the authority to go over the state's head and deal with the tribes directly. And so the Creek Treaty of 1790 is a treaty that establishes, you have to understand, we talked about this dependence on foreign manufactured goods. Well, what happens when the main source is now kicked off the continent? Now, and that was a huge crisis, because the Creeks that knew that these Americans, they were just as dependent on these foreign manufactured goods as they were. So how are they expected to maintain their status? Well, they had a little reprieve because the Spanish, through Alexander McGillivray, were able to import British goods through a British trading company and British trading partners, and continue the trade under Spanish auspices through this British trading firm, Panton and Leslie and Company, which McGillivray got a 1/8 silent partnership in for figuring that out. But then once that goes away, the Americans are going to have to assume responsibility for supplying these indigenous peoples with their needs and wants. And they were just as, we just hadn't had that emerging manufacturing core here in America.
Yeah, we couldn't make anything.
No, right. We were, but not enough. And not enough. And that's why the Spanish had to do it through that British company. So what they do is we still need to stave off a war, because we got Pontiac's rebellion looming in the foreground there in the Ohio. We've got British forts that have yet been ceded over to American hands. The last thing America wants to do is go right into an Indian war after we fought the revolution, now that we really don't have a standing army, and so forth. So the best option was to treat with the Creek Nation, which is what happened in 1790. They tried to get them to come to a delegation, and they resisted because they were pretty much happy with the Spanish situation and trading through the Panton and Leslie Company. But eventually they realized that there was a lot of commotion going on with the Georgians. the Georgians were ever increasingly squatting on Creek land. Settlers were illegally squatting. They were invading. There was horse thievery. There was illegally hunting going on. And so the feds had to step in. Federal Congress had to step in and say, look, and it had never been done before. So that's mainly what that Creek Treaty of New York was all about, was the first test case of, can the federal government, can our constitutional government step in and deal with these indigenous nations? And that really upset the Georgians, but they did get a land cession out of it.
To be honest, what doesn't?
Right. And so
all the people listening in Georgia are writing angry emails.
That's actually a really interesting dynamic that you point, but that sort of brings to light in that, post-revolution, the native tensions with the United States are sort of inherent in the dynamics of the relationships. It's like the United States doesn't want these native nations becoming closer with Britain or one of the other colonial powers for fear of them being able to manipulate them against the United States. So they're saying like, hey, you got to be friends with us. But the native nations are saying, you can't give us what we need. Right. So, there's that tension there, or that conflict is like inherent in the dynamics of the relationship.
Yeah, the greatest quote that explains that was from McGillivray. I think it was into his initial letter to the Spanish authorities in Pensacola and St. Augustine, where he wrote that the Indian Alliance or Creek Alliance goes directly to those who best supply their needs.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And that's basically what the trade was all about. Once they became completely dependent on foreign manufactured goods, their autonomy was, and the sovereignty saw a major loss, because their livelihood was at the whim of those who were supplying their needs, depending on which entity you're looking at, whether it's the British, France, or Spanish. And I think we as Americans, and one of the reasons I am so passionate about this topic is I think we could consider, ourselves being in that same position. When you talk about the Creeks being 10,000 hides in debt as early as 1715, it's like, well, we're what now? Like 30 trillion in debt? Like we can never
just
pay
a few
off.
Bucks.
Yeah, just a few bucks. And it's growing. Last I heard yesterday, it was growing by nearly $1 trillion a month.
Oh my gosh.
And it's like, what's the point of keeping track anymore? And where are we at with that? And what's going to happen to us as a result of the accumulation of national debt?
It's an interesting question. I think looking back on history could provide some insights. Obviously, there are differences between what debt is and how debt functions now versus then, but definitely not. There's definitely insight to be gained by understanding how a loss of domestic manufacturing and self-reliance affects nations over time. Because that is, go purchase that thing. If you see a Made in America sticker for a company that pays good wages to the folks that work it, that can buy the stuff that they have, go ahead and support that place. It's worth it having that stuff here versus having that somewhere else. But anyway, we are coming to the end, and but we covered a ton of really good information. Beau, are there any good books on these topics that you would recommend to our listeners if they want to dive a little bit further?
Absolutely. The first and foremost is one of my Bibles, and of course we had her on the docu-series, and that's Deerskins and Duffels by Catherine Holland Braun. She wrote just a fantastic dissection of how this all works. The numbers are really great as far as like the quantities of deerskins and population estimates throughout time. It's just a timeless work. Another one by Joshua Piker. Joshua Piker Zakfusky takes one particular Creek town, which was quite a major town in the 18th century, and just kind of looks at that one town as a microcosm for the greater trade. So that's a fantastic book. Most of the books on this subject have to do with the Creek or Muskogee in particular, because they were just located close enough to a lot of waterways to be able to dominate a lot of the trade. And then the other, if you want to learn more about the traders and the McGillivray and McIntosh Traders of the Old Southwest by Amos Wright, the late Amos Wright. And that is an absolute like Bible of genealogy of the McGillivrays and the McIntoshes, and a lot of people in the South still are descended from these people. But
is that the book that has his journals in it as part of the?
No, that you're thinking about William Coffey's Alexander McGillivray, or McGillivray of the Creeks. That was published in 1939, and that's more of a biography on, but it's very old. It heavily reliant on the original Historian of Alabama, published in 1851. You know, a lot of that's a little loosey-goosey, but
sure.
No, William Coffey's McGillivray of the Creeks, that has a lot of the original letters. So it'd be like the Alexander McGillivray papers, and that's easy to find. And then Ed Cashin wrote a lovely biography on Lachlan McGillivray. But Amos Wright really went above and beyond both those two works in my mind. But if I could pick one, definitely Catherine Braun's Deerskins and Duffels.
Very cool. Well, all those links to all those books will be in the description below. And Beau, is there any for our audience? Lynn knows exactly what your schedule is, but I might as well ask. For the audience and for us, is there any place where they can come and see your work, whether that's interpreting or explaining some of this kind of stuff, if they live in the Virginia area?
Yeah. Right now I'm portraying James Monroe at Monroe's Highland. I portray Patrick Henry for the Hanover County and Hanover Tavern about a few times a year. But I'll be anywhere from Florida to Georgia. I've done work across the country as far away as Wyoming and Utah, New York. So I'll go anywhere. But if you're wanting to see something, probably any living history event in Virginia, or within close proximity there too, but I'll probably be in Florida this winter. And you can find me on my website, beaurobbins.com.
Great. Yeah. So if you run into Monroe at Highland, make sure you ask his opinion on the deerskin trade.
And you'll get Monroe's opinion, right?
Not you get Monroe's opinion.
I don't break character to the roll the DVD commentary.
All right. Thanks so much, Lynn, for sharing your husband with us on the show, and Beau for sharing all of your knowledge. Yeah, Beau is an invaluable historical resource, and I really enjoyed this conversation.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Well, thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to the full episode of Too Complicated for History. We hope you enjoyed the episode, and if you did, please leave us a review on Odyssey, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Be sure to follow us on our social platforms at 2C4H_podcast, or check out the link in the description. This will keep you in the loop for show updates, new episodes, and exclusive content.
Too Complicated for History is a podcast from Primary Source Media, produced by Patrick Long and Lynn Price Robbins, edited and mixed by Curtis Fritsch, opening theme music by Sheena Biratella.